Scottie Pippen has had his name in headlines constantly over the past few years, especially in very recent history. And while it's easy to look at this drama on the surface level, all of this ultimately reads to me as a Robin who in hindsight does not love what came from being a Robin. And it's this case after the fact, as well as players actively leaving good situations for the sake of no longer being Robin, that makes me wonder, what is it about being a sidekick in the NBA paired next to a clearly better player that causes so many of those sidekicks to seemingly lose their minds? Why does Scottie Pippen have beef with Michael Jordan? Why did Kyrie Irving prematurely leave LeBron James? Why did Kobe eventually leaving Shaq seem like a foregone conclusion from that duo's very conception? Welcome to NBA Deep Dive. For those who might not be aware, Robin is a term used to describe the second best player in an iconic duo, of course similar to Robin, who is Batman's sidekick. In this metaphor with Kobe and Shaq as examples, Shaq is Batman and Kobe is Robin. I'd personally prefer Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, but hey, that's just me. So the question of this video is, why do players who find themselves in this position often take issue with it? What is it about being the second best player of a duo that wins at the highest level that isn't enough and drives some of these guys insane? Well, the first and simplest cause is ego. Athletes who reach the level that a Scottie Pippen, Kyrie Irving, or Kobe Bryant do almost universally have inflated egos. There is a strong correlation between professional athletics and narcissistic personality disorder. Now, this actually can have its positives. Having an inflated ego is not inherently all bad. There is actually a correlation between narcissism and performance. Sometimes, as an athlete, you have to delude yourself into believing you are the best of the best until you actually are the best of the best. Look at Michael Jordan, perhaps the greatest athlete in the history of sports. That guy is one of the greatest examples of a narcissistic athlete, if not the greatest. But while believing in yourself to a degree that it makes you a great player is all well and good, it can go too far in the opposite direction to where you take exception to the notion of being number two and thus ruin something good for the sake of satisfying your ego. Say you are Kobe Bryant and you have been the best player on every team you've been on up until you get drafted by the Los Angeles Lakers. Then, knowing you're lower in the pecking order as a 17-year-old rookie on a team with veteran guards above you that has playoff aspirations, you decide to put your head down and put in the work. You then prove that you are indeed that dude, as you have been for your entire life to that point. Now, you finally have your opportunity to prove your greatness, but there's one problem. One of the greatest players of all time at his peak just happens to be on your team. So now you're someone who's always been the best, earned your spot towards the top of the pecking order again, and now you get to the highest point, but bam, you are second. And there ain't no way you're becoming number one while this dude is around. Now, if you really are not all that self-centered and all you care about is winning and not individual glory, then you probably don't care. But if you're like Kobe and you care about your legacy and being the alpha on your team and not having that position in question, you're going to take issue with this arrangement. This is an ego-driven problem, but at the same time, it was that very ego that made Kobe as good as he was. The same thing that made Kobe one of the greatest basketball players of all time also prevented him from being capable of being number two long term. And you kind of can't have one without the other. One of the main reasons Kobe was as good as he was, and you of course want him to be as good as he was, is also the main reason he can't be your team's second best player. He has to be first. It's a good with the bad type of deal that you just kind of have to accept. But I don't think it's just plain old ego. I don't think ego alone could quite drive the wedge that existed between Kobe and Shaq. Because while that might be a driving factor, it is the perception of being number two by fans and media that pokes and prods at that ego until it boils over and creates a monster. The problem with being number two, specifically next to some of the greatest players ever, with the three main examples for this video having Shaq, LeBron, and MJ, MJ as the Batman in that arrangement, is when you play with a legend of the game, you become a part of that legend rather than creating a legend of your own. You aren't Scottie Pippen, you're a part of Michael Jordan's story. You aren't Kobe, you're the piece that finally allowed Shaq to start winning rings. You aren't Kyrie Irving, you're that guy who hit a shot in the story of how LeBron came back from a 3-1 lead. Scottie Pippen more belongs to the legacy of Michael Jordan than he belongs to the legacy of Scottie Pippen. Basketball, especially over time, becomes mythologized. These are no longer just things that happen in a sport. These are legendary stories, and some players might feel as though their character in the story isn't getting the shine that they deserve. I mean, even the fact that the second guy gets called Robin speaks to how these moments become a story. We're literally comparing being Scottie Pippen to being Robin in a superhero cartoon / comic book. It's not even remotely subtle. But the difference between a Batman cartoon and, let's say, the 1998 Chicago Bulls is one of these is fiction and the other is reality. A reality that has been mythologized, but a reality nonetheless. So when true events are packaged as a story and that story doesn't paint a full accurate picture specifically of those Robins, suddenly we have problems, either from a player taking issue after the fact like Scottie Pippen has, or from a player realizing they are in the story as it's happening and veering off the path that was laid out for them to make their own destiny, which is what Kobe and Kyrie did. The notion of Kobe being just the guy who helped Shaq win rings is ludicrous now, but that's only because he took control of his own destiny and changed the narrative. He went about making sure that that was not his legacy. Now, if you're looking for an example of a player becoming just a part of someone else's story in a more tangible sense, look no further than The Last Dance, where a documentary that was supposed to be about the 1998 Chicago Bulls ended up being 50% about the 98 Bulls and 50% about Michael Jordan, and even that 50% that was supposed to be about the 98 Bulls was still mostly about Michael Jordan. And sure, it's fair for MJ to take a lot of the spotlight when talking about the Bulls because he was easily their best player, but at the same time, a documentary advertised as a Bulls documentary that was pitched to Scottie Pippen as a Bulls documentary when he agreed to be in it, ending up being a Michael Jordan documentary. That's kind of bullshit. Well, I definitely don't totally agree with the things that Scottie Pippen has said. In fact, I don't agree with most of it. I fully understand where some of this bitterness comes from. Imagine being one of the greatest players of your generation, a top 50 player of all time who built his game from the ground up and really came out of nowhere and has a really good story, but your legacy is just MJ's sidekick.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Jordan!
And Scottie Pippen.
He's also good. Why didn't they do Jordan last?
As time goes on and we become more far removed from the events of these stories, what was previously in the gray starts to become much more black and white. And to see something that you understood to be gray then boxed into black or white in a way that paints you in a negative light especially can be maddening, and understandably so. This brings us to how narrative can get in the way of and potentially even ruin good basketball. Where a lot of animosity comes with Robins is not even necessarily in them wanting to be number one, but rather the criticism that comes from being number two.
Saying, listen, if this is the conversation, I don't want this conversation. When I retire, I don't want people to say, okay, you only won because of Shaq. As unfair as that is, Magic never won without Cap, right? Michael never won without Scottie. So, but here I am getting stuck with this argument, which is not fair, but yet this is the argument people will make, and I'm not okay with that.
In the case of Kobe Bryant, coming out of high school, he was getting comparisons to Michael goddamn Jordan. So while people were happy to see Kobe be a great second option, at the same time it was always obvious that to become the next MJ, it could not happen as the second best player on the team. It's pretty simple. You can't be the greatest player of all time if you're not even the best player on your team. So when people saw the Lakers winning titles easily, the conversation wasn't solely focused on, wow, Kobe and Shaq are really great as a duo as it should have been, but rather, man, Kobe can really only win with Shaq, or Kobe is being carried by Shaq. And someone with the aspirations and ego that Kobe did was not going to let that criticism go unanswered. Kobe wasn't allowed to exist as he was because people thought he could do more. The Lakers duo was not allowed to exist as it was because people wanted Kobe to be a solo act. This outside noise had to shape narratives, and it was those narratives in part that drove Kobe and Shaq apart. I honestly think it was these narratives that were the driving force in Kobe and Shaq splitting up. Sure, there have been a handful of listed reasons as to why the two split up, but ultimately I feel like there was an inherent animosity that was created from these narratives. So naturally those two split up, and luckily Kobe did manage to prove that he could be Batman, but there was a whole lot more that could have come of Kobe and Shaq as a duo had these narratives not put a very clear chip on Kobe's shoulder. So the next question I have is the media and are we as NBA fans right to put these expectations and criticisms on these players, knowing that it can interfere with good basketball? Now, the example I'm about to use is not really related to being a Robin, but rather an example of how narrative can drive players' decisions. Look at Kevin Durant, a player who, after a few years of failure, was starting to get criticism for his lack of a ring. This drove him to make the decision to join the Golden State Warriors in what is perhaps the most hated free agency decision in the history of sports, and certainly the most hated in NBA history. Then, with the Warriors, while KD won some rings and the Warriors were comically dominant, it also always felt like a foregone conclusion that Durant would leave the Warriors after his first contract was up. And while after the fact there were claims that it was beef with Draymond that pushed him out, in reality I think it was much more people claiming that KD's rings did not count and he needed to prove he could win a championship without a super team. Two decisions by Kevin Durant that felt a lot less like basketball-driven decisions and more like narrative-driven decisions. Especially the second one, because as good as Kyrie Irving is, no one is leaving Steph or Kyrie for basketball reasons. The narrative side of basketball drove the decision over the basketball side of basketball. So, is it right for these kinds of outside pressures to exist and thus affect the game and the decisions that players make? As I said earlier, Kobe was not allowed to be Shaq's sidekick. That was not enough for people because they had these expectations of what he should be. Is it right for them to have had those expectations? Well, unfortunately, I think it's kind of unavoidable. But in a way, that's really a two-way street. One way is more natural and fair and the other not so much. These two streets are the Kobe way and the Scottie way. In the case of Kobe Bryant, he had these aspirations to be the GOAT, and as I said earlier, you can't be the GOAT if you aren't the number one on your team for most of your career. There is just no avoiding that. So to that extent, I don't know how much you can blame people putting those expectations on him, especially being that he proved to be capable of being a solo act, and before that clearly showcased the talent and the desire to reach those heights. But then we have the Scottie Pippen way, which is a player who never quite had the aspirations for being one of the greatest players ever, or at least never appeared to. We can't say for sure because we never know. But a player who does not really have those aspirations past being number two and is content being number two, and no one really thinks can be number one, but they still get shit for being number two. I think that scenario is a whole lot more avoidable and can help prevent some animosity. It's one thing for a player clearly miscast to receive criticism because in a way that criticism comes from a place of expecting more. I've definitely taken that approach before. Russell Westbrook in the past, Anthony Davis as of very recently. When you see a player that clearly has more in them and they're not reaching that potential, it can be maddening if you're invested. And I don't think that's wrong. However, when someone is clearly a number 2 type of player and they are perfectly content in that role, I don't know if constant jokes about, oh, he's also good, in a clearly dismissive tone is a good thing. I think that played a big part in what drove Scottie mad, and I think it played a part in Kyrie leaving LeBron, even though most of us don't really think Kyrie can be Batman, and he probably didn't believe that himself as he eventually returned to that role next to Kevin Durant. He was sure as shit tired of being Robin to LeBron James, and I can't exactly blame him.
What type of parental role has he played for you and your teammates, LeBron?
Oh, okay. So you, parental role.
I feel like NBA fans can get so caught up in the notion of greatness and legacy that players who are not at the very top of that conversation are treated like footnotes or even just downright dismissed. When I released my documentary on the GOAT debate 2.5 years ago, I ended that video with a very simple statement: appreciate greatness. I felt as though in a long-winded video discussing the nuances of the most heated debate in the game, it was important to remember to appreciate these great athletes rather than looking to tear one down to uplift the other. However, to some extent, I want to amend that statement. Don't get me wrong, appreciating greatness is, well, great, but I think if we get too caught up in making this game about such a small handful of individuals, it takes away from the beauty of the game as a whole. That brings me back to what I said earlier. These Robins have a lot more of their legacies tied up in Batman than they do in themselves. Players and teams get framed as a part of a player's legacy rather than them being allowed to exist on their own. Look at how the bad boy Pistons are framed as a part of Michael Jordan's story more so than they are looked at through the lens of their own success. The 2011 finals is more about LeBron James's biggest failures than it is the Dallas Mavericks' success. The 1998 Chicago Bulls are all about how Michael Jordan was carrying them through a rough season, but let's neglect to mention in the documentary about it that they were actually immediately fine as soon as Scottie Pippen returned from injury. When the story is always Jordan, always LeBron, always Shaq, we see great players get unjustly left in the dust. And I think that is where we see these players either express a distaste for that position or take it into their own hands to get out of it. The result of which is unnecessary drama and great duos being split up. Appreciate greatness. And appreciate the pretty damn goodness too. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, but you get my point. In a basketball and a media landscape that focuses so much on Batman, Robin does not really get the shine that he deserves. And that is the plight of the Robin. Holy shit, 2 deep dives in 2 weeks. I have not accomplished that since this series started 9 months ago. Fuck, it's been 9 months. If you have made it this far, please do me a favor and drop a like on this video. I really appreciate when these deep dives reach 10,000 likes, so if you could do me that favor, it would be much appreciated. Also, if you've watched to this point and you are not subscribed to this channel already, then please change that and subscribe. I am going really hard in the month of December, including a deep dive every Friday for this entire month so that I can hit 200k subscribers by the end of the year. So if you are watching this far, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. But yeah, that is it. Goodbye.